We're going to do something rather important now. And I'm not quite sure how to do it. I don't worry, though. We'll work it out, and we'll probably work it out together. But it speaks to a much broader problem, and it's one of what you might describe as the carpet-slippered creep of fascism. Or if not fascism, then something very, very close to racism. And it's about what is becoming normalised in public discourse. And what is becoming normalised in public discourse is stuff that would have been inconceivable even 5 years ago. There is a Daily Express journalist who called this weekend for Zahra Sultana, the Labour MP, to be deported, presumably for the offence in his worldview of being brown or being a Muslim. I don't know. He has apologised and claimed that he is leaving Twitter in order to look after his mental health. Somewhat unfortunately, historic tweets have been found in which he says you should never take anybody seriously who cites their mental health when apologising for something. But hey, I think we should give this person the benefit of the doubt. It works for a newspaper I used to work for, although it was a very different beast then. I'm fairly confident that at any point in the almost 30 years since I joined the Daily Express, somebody on the political staff calling for an elected MP to be deported for presumably either religious or ethnic reasons would be a sackable offence. I think this is the first time in almost 3 decades where I sit here and say I don't think it is a sackable offence anymore, because how can the Daily Express sack him when Kemi Badenoch hasn't sacked Robert Jenrick for saying that he doesn't want to live in a country where he couldn't see any white faces on a visit to Birmingham? This is not normal discourse. And yet, I don't know, people like me, and let's be honest, there are very, very few of us in the UK media, despite the ludicrous claims from the armies of people that are comfortable with this kind of rhetoric, that people like me somehow dominate the discourse. That'd be me and Gary, would it? I don't know. But people like me I don't like talking about the immigration conversation at the moment, because it is hideous and it makes everybody who gets involved feel dirty. Some people love feeling dirty. It's all they've ever felt, and they are currently really having their time in the sun. But how do you push back against this hideousness if the people that should be pushing back against it are not? If Kemi Badenoch is not going to caution Robert Jenrick for revealing that he doesn't want to live in a country where lots of people look like her, or the Daily Express is not going to caution a journalist for calling for an elected MP to be deported on ethnic or religious grounds, or quite possibly both, you have a deep shift, a deep and obvious shift in what you would have to describe as either fascistic or racist rhetoric, culminating in an extraordinary interview this week with a politician I hadn't previously heard of. But she's essentially called for people who have every right to be here to be expelled. Let me read you the quotes. There are also a large number of people in this country who came here legally, but in effect shouldn't have been able to do so. It's not the fault of the individuals who came here. They just shouldn't have been able to do so. They will also need to go home. What that will leave is a mostly but not entirely culturally coherent group of people. This is a politician called Katie Lam, L-A-M, who is a shadow Home Office minister. And I don't want to turn this into a competition, but I think that's the single most hideous thing I've heard a mainstream main party politicians say in my lifetime. And I did a quick search when I came into work this morning, and it's been picked up by precisely nobody in the wider media. There is quite a lot of understandable anger and disgust on social media. I don't look at Twitter anymore because, well, it's part of the reason why politicians like Katie Lam think that they can say this sort of stuff with impunity now, because Elon Musk has very deliberately and very successfully created a racist sewer where racists thrive and persuade themselves that everybody else is racist too. But this is an extraordinary breach of what I would describe as the basic tenets of common decency. And it speaks to something that has been happening over the course of the last 12 months, that we are all a little bit guilty of not properly registering. So people like me, and therefore by association you, are not talking about it because it makes us feel so gross and so grim. People sitting next to Katie Lam in the House of Commons, or indeed sitting above her on the hierarchy of the Conservative Party, are not talking about it because they're frightened of upsetting all the potential voters who agree with her. It puts Nigel Farage in a very strange position in that he could reasonably argue that he is no more racist in his pronouncements or no more far right-wing in his attitudes than senior members of the Conservative Party, most obviously Robert Jenrick and this woman, Katie Lam. The idea that they will also need to go home. What do you think she means when she talks about a mostly but not entirely culturally coherent group of people? And if that's not profoundly anti-Semitic, then I don't know what is. What does that say to Orthodox Jews? What does that say to very many corners of our community where people lead deliberately and diversely different lives, culturally incohesive? And not a whisper, not a sausage. In fact, this is probably, hand on heart, put your hand up if this is the first you've heard of it. You see? How is this happening? How are we becoming a country where senior mainstream politicians can call for people who have every right to be here to be deported? I don't know if she used that word, but what else does it mean? They will need to go home. Even Enoch Powell talked about voluntary repatriation. It was one of the first jokes I ever understood. One of the first political jokes I ever understood was when Lenny Henry did a joke about the National Front offering him £10, offering black people £10 to go back home. And he said, that's fantastic, I'm from Dudley. So he gets 10 quid in a bus fare home. When they use words like home, they will need to go home. I think her grandfather was a refugee. Where was his home? Do you think? Two things occur to me, on mornings like this. The first is the immediate aftermath of Brexit, where my children's primary school, in a state primary school in West London, a Catholic primary school, had quite a high proportion of children whose parents were European Union citizens who'd come here under freedom of movement. There were a lot of Italians, actually, because it's a Catholic school, quite a few Albanians, a few French. It was a very cosmopolitan mix in primary school, both in terms of origin, national origin, and in terms of socioeconomic status. And there were kids who were turning up at school in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, wondering whether they were going to have to leave the country because of the rhetoric that surrounded it and some of the stuff that was being said on television or put on posters. They were wondering whether they were going to have to leave the country. And my heart broke because I don't know how you have that conversation with your child. I had a conversation with two families at the time, one who didn't know how to have it. They could just reassure their kids, and one who'd already decided to leave. French family, he was a banker, very, very, very high earner, and immediately after the Brexit vote, he thought, well, I'm not staying here. And both of their children had asked their parents if this meant that they would have to leave the country. So one family could say, well, no, but we're going to go anyway because of this atmosphere that has been created. And the other family didn't know what to do. I tried to give them a little bit of advice. It was one of my daughter's friends. And they can't convince a child. No, of course we won't, darling. Of course we won't. And what do you do now, 10 years later, when you've got someone from the Conservative Party saying, no, yes, you will have to go. You will need to go. You've got independent leave to remain. What? Who? What does culturally coherent mean? What does culturally coherent mean? I find this woman absolutely despicable. Am I culturally coherent with her? I think this is the single most disgusting thing since Robert Jenrick last opened his mouth that a politician in the mainstream of our political discourse has said in the last... this particular bit, that line there, they will also need to go home. I think that's the worst I've seen. I think that's worse. I think that's worse than anything Enoch Powell said in 1968. And where is the story? I mean, Enoch Powell was the biggest political story in the country for weeks, months, and it is still resonating now. The echoes of his racism still ring through the corridors of Westminster decades later. This woman can drop a little interview, friendly, largely interview in the Sunday Times, and say something that is obviously and outwardly hideous. It's not the fault of the Can you think of a more dehumanising turn of phrase than this? It's not the fault of the individuals who came here. They just shouldn't have been able to do so. They will also need to go home. What that will leave is a mostly but not entirely culturally coherent group of people. Well, I don't know who she means. How are they going to decide whether you're culturally coherent? Will they check that you're racist before you can stay? Will they check that you're white? Will they check that you're Christian? Will they check that you're Anglican? Will they check that you're a Capricorn? What does she mean? Will they check that you can quote Charles Dickens? What does culturally coherent mean? Will they check that you can deliver the rivers of blood speech from memory? Will that be enough to get you over the line if you're not too brown? And speaking of brown, I don't know if you've heard Nick Lowles, the founder of Hope Not Hate, on this programme, or indeed anywhere else. He tells a story that I can't get out of my head at the moment. He tells it in two ways. And his political awakening came during the heyday of the National Front in the 1970s, some 2 decades before this woman was born, when "There ain't no black in the Union Jack" was routinely chanted on our streets, and when people would be chased down the road for the sin of being dark-skinned, where skinhead violence against ethnic minorities was a fact of life for these people, because they were not culturally coherent, as Katie Lam might say. And this is when Nick Lowles, whose mother was from Mauritius, first started hearing about compulsory deportation. First started hearing rhetoric like "they will need to go home." And he felt, in his childhood way, that his mum would be on that list. He was worried his mum would be deported. And you're a kid, right? So you can't always have these conversations with your parents. The things you're frightened of as children are often the things that you're least likely to talk to your parents about. So number one, you have an 8-year-old boy sitting in suburban Britain, worried that his mummy is going to be deported because people like Katie Lam say they will need to go home. And the next bit of the story didn't actually fully register with me the first time he told me. It was the second time he was coming into the studio that I wanted him to repeat it. He used to go on holiday to, I don't know, Brittany or somewhere mildly warmer than here. Don't at me with your meteorological complaints. And he wouldn't get out of the tent on the beach, and his family didn't know why. And it's because he is, to all intents and purposes, Anglo-Saxon looking or culturally coherent. But because of his mother's Mauritian heritage, or because of his own Mauritian heritage via his mother, he had a little bit more melanin than a Celt like me. So if he was in the sunshine, he would go quite dark quite quickly. So you have an 8-year-old child worried that he might not be culturally coherent enough to avoid compulsory deportation, or being told that he will need to go home. Or, you know, you can stay, 8-year-old boy, but your parents are off, deliberately sheltering himself from the sunshine because he was worried that if his suntan was too dark, he'd be on the list that people like Katie Lam are now making in the pages of the Sunday Times on an almost daily basis. They will also need to go home. What that will leave is a mostly but not entirely culturally coherent group of people. Where are the Nick Lowleses of today, I wonder? How does this rhetoric reach you? I am so privileged. Look, I'm Irish, And I can be a bit of a troublemaker from the point of view of people like Honest Bob Jenrick and Katie Lam and the rest of them. I believe Nigel Farage recently called me a moron in this very studio. So it's always good to know that your words aren't going completely ignored and your ability to see clearly precisely what these people are is clear to them. But it doesn't really affect me. It's going to be a long time before any of them come after people with apostrophes in their name. Never say never. That's what Martin Niemöller taught us. But it's going to be a long time before the Irish are back on the list with the dogs and the blacks for not being sufficiently culturally coherent in the worldview of people like Katie Lam. But the fact that no one else is talking about it today, I'm not sure anybody else even noticed, except some of the usual suspects fighting the good fight on social media, in my case, Blue Sky, where once again Sundar Katwala is doing brilliant work, pointing out the parallels with Enoch Powell, pointing out the horrors of what is being said here. And it was an academic called Ben Ansell, who's Professor of Comparative Democratic Institutions at Nuffield at the University of Oxford, who pointed out that this is not normal discourse. He wrote, "It is not just a bit of fun for a Sunday paper interview. It is beyond the realms of the concept of decency shared across the political spectrum until last year." Bringing that Daily Express quotes journalist, end quotes, back into it, he writes, "Apropos of nothing, I really do think UK journalists and politicians need some reminding that mass deportation of legal immigrants, particularly those with permanent status, is far more extreme than even Trump's America and would basically place Britain completely on its own among democracies." Shadow Home Office Minister puts us slightly to the right of Genghis Khan, and it gets picked up, as far as I can tell, precisely nowhere. So, you remember when we came across that line about "I don't mean you"? When the racist would say, "I voted Brexit to get rid of all the immigrants." You'd say, "Well, I'm an immigrant." And they'd say, "Oh, I don't mean you." I think they mean you now. You've got your independent leave to remain. You're here legally. Or you're waiting for your independent leave to remain. They will also need to go home. How does this rhetoric, whether it's a Daily Express journalist calling for an elected politician to be deported because she's brown or Muslim or both, whether it's a Shadow Home Office minister in the Sunday Times newspaper calling for everybody who doesn't fit her notion of cultural coherence to be removed from the country and sent, quotes, home, end quotes, even if this is home, even if this is the only home your children have ever known. When Robert Jenrick talks about not liking it, not wanting to live in a country where all the faces that he sees are black or brown, despite choosing to live in a village where all the faces that he sees are exclusively white. How does it change the way you feel about this country, about your home, when these voices are not being challenged and silenced as they were in Enoch Powell's day, but they are being amplified and lionized? How does it make you feel? I can't believe how quickly it's happened until I look at America.